This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I have the enormous pleasure of having a friend of mine on the podcast. Tim Robey is a film critic for The Telegraph and has written an amazingly entertaining book, Box Office Poison, Hollywood's Story in a Century of Flops. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Tim.
Thanks very much for having me.
So we have talked about this actually in London during a BFI sponsored sort of Q&A, which was a really good conversation, and it feels like it's been a little bit of a warm up to our conversation today as well, which took part as part of the London Film Festival. One of the things I asked you there, and I think it's worth repeating right at the top of this conversation, is your definition of a flop, because there's a little bit of not controversy, but there's a little bit of fuzziness.
For sure, yeah, you can define a flop in all sorts of ways. Some people would say any film that is released to kind of general ridicule could be considered a flop, if that means bad reviews, for example. And that's almost regardless of whatever the box office performance of the film is. But I needed to narrow down the subject. So I decided for the book I was going to choose films that really had lost a huge chunk of their production budget where possible. So a film that lost, 50% of its initial budget before you even add on marketing, advertising, and distribution costs and all those other things you have to add. So I didn't, for that reason, include, for example, Exorcist II, The Heretic, which was German's much derided and critically savaged sequel to The Exorcist. Considered a big flop, but only really by comparison to the first film, because it grossed $30 million on a budget of about 14. So it wasn't hugely profitable, but it really was only by comparison to The Exorcist that it was considered such a disappointment. So I didn't put that in the book, but I have included films which really did lose the shirt off their directors' backs, if you like.
Right.
Films that bankrupted people, films that bankrupted studios. Those are the ones I went for.
And you begin with the granddaddy of them all, Intolerance by D.W. Griffiths. Tell us a bit about this film, because I quite naively thought that round about the beginning of of motion pictures, nobody would lose money because it was such a novel thing that people wanted, give me my money, as they say in the GIF.
Yeah, and Griffith had come off this enormous commercial success with The Birth of a Nation, which is such a notorious film today, but back then in 1915 was like the big blockbuster of its day. It was staggeringly profitable. It made over $20 at the box office, which is these days extraordinary. So he assumed he was, basically he was set up for life, and he reinvested a lot of that profit in his next production through his own company, and that was Intolerance. But there was a level of hubris there, because really Intolerance was conceived as a kind of riposte to anyone who dared criticize him for The Birth of a Nation. It was a retort to his critics, to the backlash against that film that had kind of grown up a little bit surrounding its racism and other things. Griffith was furious with anyone charging him with that. So he made a film that was essentially anti-censorship, film that was about the intolerance of critics and censors across 4 different historical timeframes. It started to just balloon out of control. The indulgence of the filmmaking was enormous. Even though these days it is considered kind of one of the masterworks of silent cinema on a technical level, when it came out in 1916, critics were the only people who liked it. In fact, popularity eluded it totally. America was entering the First World War. No one was in the mood for D.W. Griffith's rather self-involved rant. No one really understood what the film was all about or for. And so, having spent millions on this film, and millions more to release it as a roadshow around America in specially decorated cinemas and so on. Griffith was brutally disappointed just weeks after it came out, and there's a chunk in all of his biographies. There's a quote where he talks about wandering through the darkened theaters, the empty theaters, bashing his shins on the empty seats, basically, and he realized that the dream was over. And in fact, it did bankrupt him forever, the failure of that film. He was so broke after it came out that he couldn't even fund the demolition of the set. So the enormous Babylon set that he built on the corner of Sunset and Hollywood Boulevard stayed there, just kind of like gradually falling to bits for the next several years until the police department in LA finally pulled it down.
I seem to remember the Taviani brothers made a film about a couple of Italian sculptors going over to Hollywood and making the elephants because they'd done it in Cabiria, and he hired them to come over especially. What's the name of that film? Yeah. Anyway, that's a little digression. So he was the Ricky Gervais of his day, then, sort of shouting out for free speech as long as people weren't criticizing him. That was the limit of free speech.
That's right. And I think that the lesson of that film from a kind of industry point of view was don't get so caught up in yourself and don't try to be a one-man film studio, because that rarely works out.
Yeah, and it's sort of like don't get high on your own supply, sort of thing. Never put your money into the business. And of course, this is a pattern which gets repeated. Someone having a huge hit like Birth of a Nation, and then going on to sort of get more, they throw money at them, and they inevitably make the next movie is a massive flop.
Yeah, this does happen quite a lot with these guys. Always guys who, assuming that they're at the very pinnacle of their profession after they've had a great success. After The Deer Hunter, which won him Oscars and was an enormous hit, he plows straight into Heaven's Gate. He demands untold millions, at least $40 million, and he bankrupts the studio, United Artists, who are funded. The amount of time and resources that he ate up during the making of that film is legendary. But it's been written about a lot, Heaven's Gate. So I actually didn't do a whole chapter on it. I did, however, do a chapter on a similar scenario, which was William Friedkin's Sorcerer from 1977. Friedkin had just made The Exorcist, and that was an extraordinary phenomenon. And he thought he was untouchable in the 70s. He thought he was better than all of those other guys, the Coppolas, the Spielbergs, the Bogdanoviches, anyone. He thought Jaws wasn't much good, for example. He was offered a chance to produce it, and he didn't even like the finished film. He thought it wasn't impressive. He thought whatever his next film was going to be the one, right? The biggest film of the year. So he persuaded Universal and Paramount in the end to split the cost on this production and fund his kind of adventure down into the jungle to make effectively a remake of The Wages of Fear. And the cost and the chaos of that production is legendary. And so is the failure of it at the box office. It had terrible fortune in coming three weeks after Star Wars opened. It got released. And no one was in the mood for freaking Sorcerer, because all anyone wanted to do was go and see Star Wars again. Star Wars was this huge breath of fresh air after the decade of kind of grim, gritty, and nihilistic cinema that had flourished, I guess, in the early 70s, we would say. And Friedkin was very much a part of that. But suddenly George Lucas brought fun back to cinema. And Sorcerer was the victim of that. It was destroyed, and it actually got terrible reviews as well. And Friedkin thinks that those were down to his reputation in the industry as a bully, as a tyrant who was called Hurricane Billy on this film. He fired 5 production managers. He was becoming deeply unpopular, and there was this sense of his arrogance that was building and building. And he thinks that critics sensed this and had their knives out for him. As he put it, it was payback time, and I was the piñata.
That's brilliant, but I mean, he kind of deserved it as well. I don't have much, I don't have that much sympathy. And I mean, I love Sorcerer. I actually got the opportunity to see it in Venice with William Friedkin in attendance and introducing it, and it was a brilliant experience. having said that, it was never a hugely commercial film, even before Star Wars came out. I mean, you look at those 70s movies like The Conversation and films like that, and they were just sort of like, we look at them now as wonderful, but I don't know what their box office performance necessarily was. Especially The Conversation's kind of a quite small film as well.
That's it. I think you can get away with that on a smaller budget, and you can build up a sense of prestige. And those films relied on like being nominated for the Oscars and Best Picture and so forth. But the problem with Sorcerer was that Friedkin spent a big budget on it. $22 million in the end, which was
Wow.
overages as well. It wasn't supposed to be that high. It was originally budgeted at like 12 or 13 million. And originally it was supposed to star Steve McQueen. And that was what Universal were banking on. They thought, well, if you've got a star that big in a gritty kind of all male adventure story like this, what can go wrong? But Steve McQueen bailed on it because he didn't want to go and shoot the film down in Ecuador as it was then supposed to be. He just married Ali McGraw. He wanted her to come along. He wanted her to have like a credit on the movie, perhaps
Mm.
associate producer or even an acting role. And Friedkin said, absolutely not. She's not coming. So Friedkin kind of threw his toys out of the pram, basically. And Steve McQueen said, well, I'm not going to do it then. Suddenly, all of Friedkin's kind of dream cast started just dropping out of it. He didn't get any of them in the end, except for Amadou. Is the only of the four actors in the film. That's the only actor, the French Moroccan actor who's brilliant,
Mm.
who was his first choice. So with Roy Scheider, who's a much less big star than Steve McQueen, respected actor, obviously, it becomes much harder to market, and that's why Universal asked Paramount to come in and split the cost with them. They could see that the film was becoming wildly expensive. Friedkin says often that the writing was on the wall, that the production seemed doomed, and the chaos of it. He built for the famous scene in the film. He had to construct with his production designer John Box a bridge that cost $1 million over this raging river. They started to build it, and rainfall just stopped and the river dried up completely, and this bridge was a bridge over nothing. The sequence couldn't work that way, so the only way to rescue the film, and it needed this big sequence, it's the centerpiece of the film, was to transport the bridge piece by piece to another river in Mexico, which cost another $2 million. This is big money at the time. He cashed in all of his credit in the industry, sort of saying, I am William Friedkin. This will do some masterpiece. Trust me, pay me more. Let's build this bridge again. So he does that. They get the sequence. It's phenomenal. I mean, the scene is incredible. It's Tarantino calls it one of the great action scenes of all time. But it was still impossible to sell this to an audience in 1977 because of the Star Wars effect. Because Star Wars is a galaxy far, far away. That's where people wanted to be. And Sorcerer is a hell on earth film. It's an ordeal. It's harrowing. It's brutal, and no one was in the mood for that.
There's no way you're going to actually sell it to people as well by saying, "Oh, and there's this great bit in the middle where it rains a lot and there's a bridge." You should see
Exactly.
this bridge. I mean, the other thing that I notice as a similarity between these two movies is as well that sort of Life and Limb. I mean, we're talking about flop in terms of commercially, but also Life and Limb was very much risked on both of these productions, right?
Yeah, for sure. Very dangerous. Like about half the crew and cast on Sorcerer were hospitalized for various tropical illnesses like gangrene and malaria and so on. During the bridge scene, the truck fell off the bridge 6 or 7 times, and the crew had to count themselves lucky that they weren't drowned inside the truck. Intolerance. Griffith had chaos on set of Intolerance. He had real elephants coming into the set and just being hormonally chaotic because no one knew how to really handle elephants on a film set in 1916. He had extras who he paid additionally to jump off the battlements. Uh, People were being sent to the hospital tent. I think there were 60 injuries within like a week of the film starting, for example. And honestly, it was just bedlam. But so health and safety, let's face it, doesn't start to improve in the cinema until well into the second half of the 20th century. There is still a lot of madness going on a set like Dune, for example. The David Lynch version of Dune
Also
had
in
people
your book.
breaking their legs. Indeed, yeah, another one in the book. People breaking their legs. There was a second unit cameraman jumped off a sand dune and broke his leg. The actor Jürgen Prochnow suffered first and second degree burns from the green gas device that's billowing from his mouth during his final scene with the Baron in the film. And that was only even after he was laid out on the same stretcher for that sequence, and a light bulb exploded above his head, and he had to roll off the stretcher. Otherwise, he'd been savaged by, shards of molten glass. So yeah, health and safety definitely is a kind of running thread through the book. Heaven's Gate, another one, and Heaven's Gate, a horrific set from the point of view of animal treatment as well, animal abuse. And the American Humane Association stepped in really as a result of that film and started to monitor film shoots much more closely and insist on no animals being harmed as that disclaimer.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I've got the Taviani brothers film that I mentioned earlier is called Good Morning Babylon, and it's from 1987. Stars Greta Scacchi and Charles Dance as D.W. Griffiths. So there you go. That's about the making of Intolerance. I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite film from the book? Because there's some of these films you're thinking, how the heck is that a flop? It's such an amazing piece of work. I've got my own favorite, I think, but I want to hear yours first.
I've already talked a lot about Sorcerer. That is one of them for me. But
right.
I guess my pet favorite is probably George Miller's Pig in the City from 1998, the sequel to Babe. A film that more people, when I mention that being in the book, people are surprised that it was a flop than any other film, because people actually do think of that film as really quite something. I think it's incredible, but it's also a deeply perverse film. It's a sort of so tonally different from the first Babe, and it's a result of George Miller being quite kind of pissed off, really, that his own creative vision on the first Babe as a producer and writer was challenged by the director Chris Noonan, who wanted to make a much cuddlier film, more pastoral, more more cozy, and that none of those adjectives apply to George Miller really ever. He wanted to make it much darker, much more perilous and full of jeopardy. So we end up with Babe, Pig in the City, a film in which Farmer Hoggett falls down the well 3 minutes into the film and breaks pretty much every bone in his body in a deeply harrowing scene, which he was originally supposed to die in. That was the script said, right, we're going to kill off Farmer Hoggett in minute 3. So this is the George Miller approach to Babe, and you wind up with essentially a kind of Mad Max film with a talking pig. But I find it jaw-dropping and extremely interesting. And some of the set pieces in it are extraordinary. The loose use of slow motion, the scenes with Babe running around, basically these scrapyard dogs around the city canals and so on, are just extraordinary. Some of the highlights for me of George Miller's whole career. So I have a lot of time for Babe, Pig in the City. I remember paying to see it twice in 98 when I was an undergraduate, just bunking off and going to see Babe 2. And honestly, the pattern of that film, and the reason it was a flop, is that children found it traumatic and just wanted to get the hell out of it, running away screaming from the film. And that's what happened the first time George Miller showed it to the executives at Universal. He'd been making it in Australia, thousands of miles away from the oversight of the studio. They begged him, please show it to us and show it to our kids. We're going to have a huge screening. We can't wait. And he brings it over to do that. And the children flee. The children flee. The children are not happy. And then Universal go into kind of damage limitation mode. And there is definitely a phase of that film's post-production where all hands are on deck trying to make it normal, trying to make it. But there's only so much you can do with a film that is as dark and difficult and challenging as this is. So they tried their best, but yeah, they still couldn't claw it back. When the film came out, 2 of the most senior executives at Universal were fired because it lost so much money.
Wow. And the thing is, with several of these films, I was sort of thinking to myself immediately as I was reading the chapters, I really hope there's a director's cut of this. I really hope I can see the original version that got cut down. I thought that about this. I thought that about Rollerball. I thought that about, I guess most famously, Magnificent Ambersons, the Orson Welles film.
Yeah, that's the most tragic example where we all wish that we could see the Orson Welles cut, 137-minute cut that he originally assembled um, before swanning off to Brazil to shoot this documentary for Nelson Rockefeller at the exact moment where the film was being edited and then tested. And the timing again was awful for Magnificent Ambersons because Pearl Harbor had just happened. And Orson Welles had made this very elegiac film about the decline of industry in the Midwest and this stately family's kind of undoing. And suddenly the public mood was just, no, we're going to war and we need industry to work for us. Like, how is that film's message going to gel with the public mood? And RKO panicked because the test screenings were so bad. People found the film wildly melodramatic and heavy and overlong and sort of oppressive. And RKO insisted that the editor, Robert Wise, cut it down, which is why it got hacked down to an 88-minute version with a newly shot happy ending, completely against Welles's wishes. But he was too far away to really, stick up for the film or intervene in the ways that he could have. And this haunted him forever. The fact that he essentially abandoned his child, if you like, and the studio and Robert Wise cut it down to that shape. And we're left with 2/3 of a great film, I think, which is not nothing at all, but it's a bit like an incredible statue with kind of its legs missing. When you watch it, you can see the point at which the studio stepped in and said, we're not gonna let this film stretch over an hour and a half, honestly. And they still dumped it. They dumped it on the second half of a bill with a comedy vehicle starring Lupi Velez, and did not give it any support. So yeah, a brutal flop for Orson Welles, which he never really recovered from, honestly.
And his friendship with Robert Wise ended there as the editor, who would then become a director and go on to direct films such as West Side Story and The Haunting.
And The Sound of Music, yeah, absolutely.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Looking at these other films, some of them are just, well, what can we say about films such as The Adventures of Pluto Nash, Catwoman, Supernova? Yeah. I mean,
there's a phase in the book around there in the early noughties where those films were coming out where I really kind of drag people through the bins. And it's the kind of stinky section of the book where the films are largely terrible. But that's the moment when I started reviewing professionally. And I kind of remember those experiences coming out of the press screenings for those films thinking, what on earth? How did that film come into existence almost? And what can possibly have gone so wrong to result in this? I can't believe that The Adventures of Pluto Nash cost $100 million in 2002, of which 20 million went straight to Eddie Murphy for his salary. The film's worldwide gross was 7.1 million. The extent of the misjudgment on that film, the corruption actually involved as well, which that I mentioned in the chapter, the kind of graft, the pocketing of studio money that's being splurged on these things, and who knows where most of it went, because it does not look like it did not end up on the screen. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a funny thing as well, isn't it? Because you see these figures and then you watch the movies and you go, well, where's the money? I don't see the money. I mean, another example of that kind of, actually, a sort of a different film and a counter example, maybe something like Cutthroat Island, where you do get quite a spectacular film, and they obviously have spent money on it, but the film itself is fairly formless, and it comes out at a little bit the wrong time because, as you point out in your chapter, Pirates of the Caribbean will come out and will show that pirate movies can make money.
Yeah, they must have been really panicking. I think Disney, dreading the same fate for Pirates that Cutthroat Island had suffered. But there is a difference, which is that with the clout of Disney behind it, and with a star as big as Johnny Depp, you've got two big promotional assets there to kind of get the film off the ground. And also it's based on a very famous, Disneyland ride and so on. So it's got kind of the IP value of that. Cutthroat Island actually had none of those things, especially when they lost Michael Douglas, who was supposed to be the male lead. And he left the production only weeks before it was due to shoot because he didn't like the role that he'd been handed, really. He thought that Gina Davis's role kept getting better and bigger while his kept dwindling. So he jumped out on the film. And in many scenarios, that would cause a film just to be cancelled, right? It would never never kind of get in front of cameras. Look at what just happened with Joaquin Phoenix in the Todd Haynes movie, for example. They're not making it. But the company that made Cutthroat Island were in an extremely precarious position right then because they'd already borrowed $50 to $60 million from different international distributors to get the film off the ground and to fund the location shoots and start building the sets and all of that. And that money was gone essentially. And then Michael Douglas jumps out, so they have this film ready to pop, and they have to recast. And none of them A-list actors in Hollywood are interested in taking these kind of sloppy seconds, if you like, of this role. They try everyone. They try, everyone from Mel Gibson to Charlie Sheen to Kurt Russell. So many actors turn it down. Keanu Reeves, and then they wind up with Matthew Modine, who's just simply not enough of a box office draw. And then meanwhile, Rennie Harlin is just determined to pursue the film, pursue his vision, no matter how much it costs, and ends up spending a fortune on it. Doing some really impressive work on the stunt side of things, I must say. And I do like the physical aspects of that production. You could see that they built the movie, they shot the movie, they did all of these crazy stunts. Gina Davis nearly broke her back doing some of them. And it's quite impressive as a physical production. But because Carolco were already essentially bankrupt, they had no money in the coffers to promote the film when it came out. They declared bankruptcy a month before it came out. And then it just dribbled in cinemas, and no one even knew it was coming out. It did absolutely atrociously in its first week, died everywhere. And I think it's unfortunate. I think that's an unlucky case where I'm kind of sympathetic to the film because I quite enjoy it. We're screening it in a couple of weeks, actually, in Rye, which is the 13th century pirate capital of the UK. So I found a good spot to screen that one.
Excellent. That's a brilliant. And you're going to do like a Q&A with it, or you're going to do
just
sort
a
of
little
an introduction?
Just a little intro in variety. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. I mean, when we talked about Orson Welles earlier, there's a sense that this Magnificent Ambersons sort of scarred him, and it was a real stumble in his career, right? With his second film. So it sort of deflected him in a different direction. Not that he didn't make some amazing movies afterwards, obviously, but there are also the cases in your book where you feel that the flops had something of a salutary effect on the directors. I'm thinking of a film such as, well, I mean, we've already mentioned Dune, which, although it had a terrible effect at the time on David Lynch, it also sort of keyed him up to go back to being David Lynch. And the other one that I was thinking in particular was also the Hudsucker Proxy, which without the Hudsucker Proxy, if the Hudsucker Proxy was a huge success, it's debatable whether you would have got Fargo, for instance.
That's kind of my theory, yeah. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have a lot of affection for the Hudsucker Proxy now, but it was commercially really bad. It did so badly in America. It made about $2.5 million on a budget of at least 25 and possibly as much as 40 million. It was a really damning failure, and they'd already also just come off two other not profitable films. Miller's Crossing and Barton Fink had not really made money. So it was their third one in a row. And because Hudsucker was so expensive and so stylized with all of those sets, those extraordinary, spires, the cityscape, and so on, all of that stylization counted against them really when the film was a commercial pariah, I'm going to say. The Coen brothers admit they were pressured in the direction of doing the exact opposite after that, going for very simple, minimalist, bleak kind of authenticity. And that's why we have Fargo, which I think is visually almost the exact opposite film to the Hudsucker Proxy. It's so flat. It's just snow everywhere. There's very few sets in the film at all. Everything on screen is kind of real. And instead of the pitter-patter dialogue, the sort of screwball dialogue in Hudsucker, you get just like grunted monosyllables in Fargo. But it works amazingly well. And I feel like perhaps because they were pushed that way, they made the virtues of it. And for that reason, I feel like they learned valuable lessons on Hudsucker, which is not to say that it's, an entirely bad film at all. I think there are definitely problems with it, but because of it, we get Fargo, and because of Dune, in many ways, we get Blue Velvet. Dino De Laurentiis produced Dune, and despite its failure, despite the impossibility of marketing a David Lynch version of the Frank Herbert novel Dune to, Star Wars fans and 6-year-olds, how's that going to work? Despite all the chaos and difficulties they faced in the production in Mexico on Dune, Dino De Laurentiis, to his great credit, was not ready to give up on David Lynch. And he said, I'm going to give you another shot on a much lower budget, but you can have Final Cut this time. Here's $6 million and you can make whatever you want. And he makes Blue Velvet. And Blue Velvet just cements Lynch's aesthetic for good, doesn't it? Without it, I don't think we have Twin Peaks, Mulholland Drive, and everything else. Dune could have been a career killer if it weren't that his producer was willing to extend him that life raft, if you like.
It's so funny as well that David Lynch was going to make Return of the Jedi. It was George Lucas's one of his choices.
I quite like the story of that. So yeah, Lucas says, I want you to come in for a meeting. So Lynch flies in to LA, and George Lucas picks him up in his sports car and drives him around and says, here's what we've got, and shows him some Wookiees in the production office. This was when Return of the Jedi was going to end on the Wookiee planet, and then it was switched to Ewoks. And Lynch was just being shown all this stuff and just had this growing migraine as Lucas was just kind of telling him about all the story beats and so on, and saying, you're going to be amazing, you'll do such a good job. And Lynch just thought to himself, he's already got all of this in his head. There's nothing I can add. There's nothing creatively or in design terms that I can really bring to this party. It's preconceived. So he just knew he was not going to want to do it. So he just basically flatly refused. But then Dune was much more tempting for him because no one had succeeded in getting a Dune production off the ground, despite Jodorowsky's attempt in the 1970s, famously. There was a shortfall. He couldn't get enough money together to make that work. So they did spend many millions of dollars and years of time in pre-production on his version, but it hadn't made it to the starting line. And Ridley Scott had a little stab at it, but he didn't want to shoot it in Mexico. And so it fell into Lynch's lap. And Lynch really did like the idea because there were these 4 planets. No one's visualized them before. There are all these creatures. There's the costumes. There's everything. There's so much. It's like a playground for him to work in design terms. And I think on that level, I really like his version of Dune. I think as a design playground, it is quite sumptuous and spectacular. And I've watched it many times, and I kind of relish the details. But in narrative terms, it is a bust. And that's partly because he tried to squeeze that entire book into just one film, which doesn't work. And Villeneuve found a solution in breaking it back into 2. But I still have a lot of affection for the Lynch version. I think aesthetically, in design terms, I kind of prefer it, I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think the Baron Harkonnen, and especially the Beast Harkonnen, is so good in that. And funnily enough, he crops up in a Coen Brothers collaboration with Sam Raimi, Crime Wave, where he plays a villain as well. I mean, what's the name? He's an Israeli actor. He's called Paul Smith, I think.
Is it Paul Smith? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very boring name compared to what a oversized character he plays in both those films. I mean, the pièce de résistance, if you'll excuse me a little bit of French pronunciation, has to be Cats of this book. This is I mean, there were moments in this book that I was laughing out loud all the way through it. And before we get on to Cats, actually, it's just something that occurred to me while I was listening to you talk about Sorcerer and some of these other problem productions, because you mentioned Jaws early on, and I think it's kind of funny that if Jaws hadn't made all that money, which of course is a very big if, I could see Jaws being in this book in terms of its tortured production and all the rest of it. And then it just made the money, and then everything retrospectively looks fine.
Yeah, Spielberg really thought that he was making the flop of his lifetime during Jaws because everything was going wrong. You know, the shark was broken, famously. He just couldn't get the thing to work. It was one of those infamous examples of a production at sea just taking forever and costing more and more money. And the studio were breathing down his neck, and he was really paranoid, actually, that he was going to get like sacked, and that this was going to be the end of his career. And what a turnaround that was for him to make like the biggest hit of the year out of that. I feel like the pattern there repeats itself a little bit with Titanic as well,
Mm.
because Titanic was hyped as the biggest flop ever before it came out. All the pre-release stuff had been about, how the budget had ballooned 200 million. Again, two studios had gone in together to split the costs on it. And the production had taken forever, and people had nearly drowned, and all this stuff. Everyone was like, "This is going to be a disaster." They expected it to be again a career ruiner for James Cameron, and even in the first week of its release, it didn't gross a particularly good figure, 25 million or so
Right.
in America. That's on a budget of like 200, and everyone was still really worried. But then it hung in there, and then word of mouth meant that people just went back to see it again and again and again, and it stayed number one at the box office for 15 weeks, which is an
Wow.
insane length of time, right? It's unheard of. Probably since the days of The Birth of a Nation, you would struggle to find another film with that much longevity, with the possible exception of The Sound of Music or maybe E.T. I think those, or Gone with the Wind, these are the only ones that I could throw in. But Titanic obliterated all the records when it came out, and proved James Cameron to be kind of untouchable, which he's then proved again with both Avatar films. The man at the box office just does not put a foot wrong. The Abyss, we could talk about. I really like The Abyss, but that's his one slight stumbling block in terms of commerce, I suppose.
Yeah, that is so fascinating because that I remember before Titanic came out, I remember reading an article saying if everybody in the world bought two tickets, it still wouldn't make money. That's how big the budget is. And then yeah, it became this steamroller of profitability. I think I might have gone to see it twice. I didn't even like it that much, but just because it was such a spectacle on the big screen.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's suddenly no one could talk about anything else. I met the other night. I met Guy Pearce at a screening. I'd never met him before, and for some reason we were talking about LA Confidential, and he was slightly kind of ruefully shaking his head about like, it was so unlucky that LA Confidential came out in the same awards cycle as Titanic, because any other year, LA Confidential would have swept the board. It would have won Best Picture, Best Director. Kim Basinger would still have won supporting actress. I imagine Russell Crowe might have been nominated. There would have
Mm.
been a sweep there. But Titanic just stole all of its oxygen basically, and won what, 13 Oscars, is it? And that an insane haul as well. But yeah, it was one of those once in a generation hits, I think. And yeah, the film in my book, which kind of comes up against Titanic in a way, is Speed 2,
Right.
because Fox were making them both simultaneously. And when Titanic had to be delayed to that Christmas in '97, Fox were left with this big hole in their summer schedule. And so they shunted Speed 2 into existence, despite the fact that it was deeply unready and stupid and set on a cruise ship, and had a script so stupid that Keanu Reeves decided, absolutely not, I'm not coming back to this because this is the wrong sequel to Speed. I'm not exactly sure what the right sequel to Speed would have been, because really, if you analyze the plot of Speed, how do you write a coherent sequel to it? It just doesn't really work. I mean, Die Hard, you just put Bruce Willis in another scrape again, right? You move him to an
Mm.
airport or whatever. But with Speed, you've got a bomb on the bus, and like, how do we repeat that? It's just very difficult to see how they could have done it. But Keanu saw the iceberg looming, if you like, and he did not agree to do it, and so they had to recast, and they brought in Jason Patric. Sandra Bullock did agree to do it, but mainly because she wanted Fox to fund her next film, Hope Floats. That was her
Mm.
like passion project, and she was like, "They'll do that if I do Speed 2 for them." So she jumps in, but even she now says that she will never do another sequel because her view of it is basically slow boat slowly going towards an island. What was I thinking?
I mean, Father Ted did the best Speed spin-off with the milk float, and yeah, that's what they should have done. The milk float going around Craggy Island. So we get to Cats. So we arrive at the denouement of. I don't know why I'm insisting on this on these.
So much French
I
coming from you
know.
just towards les chats, should we call it? Yeah, I don't know.
So this was one of my favorite chapters, and I just the story specifically of the sort of what do you call it, the comfort animal that you need before when you're going on an aeroplane.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, I can relay that. So Andrew Lloyd Webber, who understandably wanted to distance himself from the film Cats when it came out, um, gave an interview to the FT in which he said that he'd warned Universal a year before it went into production. He'd written to Donna Langley there and said, "You're going to be in real trouble if you pursue this because they don't know what they're doing. This is going to be a shit show essentially." She never replied. And then he had to go and see it and watched it, and just his jaw dropped, like everyone else's did, at how wrong the film was, how weird, how misjudged, how just like completely miscalculated it all is. He then had to stay kind of on message a little bit, obviously when he's kind of walking the red carpets and pretending it's all fine before it comes out. But in the wake of it coming out and being eviscerated by critics and the public, he bought an emotional support dog, a Havanese puppy called Mojito. And this was during the pandemic, remember, because the pandemic very suspiciously began just 3 months after Cats was released. I don't know. The conspiracy theories there are rife, but so Andrew Lloyd Webber has this dog, and he's wanting to get to New York during the pandemic. But how do you transport this dog? And the airline said something like, "Well, you're going to need special dispensation for whatever reason." So he wrote to them, and he said, "Well, I'm just going to have to say that have you seen what Hollywood did to the film version of my musical Cats?" And the airline wrote back with a line just saying, "No doctor's report required."
What went so wrong? Because you think Jesus Christ Superstar was made into a movie successfully. There had been musicals based on popular shows before. What was particularly bad about Cats?
I think it was the wrong time, the wrong approach, the wrong cast, the wrong director, and just the wrong visual scheme for it. I think like Cats for me belongs to the 80s on stage, right?
Right.
And it's sort of like a ballet in a way. You kind of accept the illusion of actors in cat suits dancing around the stage as cats in the same way that you would go and watch Swan Lake or something like that. It kind of works as a stage illusion. But to try and do it with like verisimilitude in this kind of like very high-tech way with this digital fur technology that Tom Hooper insisted on using was just such a weird mismatch. It just led to an absolute headache of a film to watch. And who knows how big the cats are? They just seem to be huge in one shot and tiny in the next. The sets seem nightmarish, like something out of Alice in Wonderland. They just never figured out how to get the cats to work in a pseudo-realistic kind of effects movie environment in that way. And I think once they started to go down that road, there was nothing else that could really be done. I think it ends up making the musical just look ludicrous and also kind of creepy. So there were just so many misjudgments, and also the kind of race to finish it was a big factor in it failing. The kind of micromanaging of the effects stuff, which was going on while the trailer was being cut together that summer, meant that all anyone was doing was pouring all of their energy into getting this 2 minute trailer ready. They devoted months and months of their time to kind of like impressing everyone with this trailer, which was then the laughing stock of the internet, and which immediately just made the film feel like it was going to be the punch bag of the season. And then they've only got a few more months left to finish the entire rest of the entire film, which is why the effects were in such a kind of shoddy and unfinished state by the time the film came out. All those poor artists, the VFX guys who were working like 80, 90-hour weeks, sleeping under their desks, trying to finish this film to Tom Hooper's specifications as he was insisting that every shot needed completing. They just didn't have time to do it well. And so everyone gets egg on their face. All the actors look silly because the effects just don't work. And then the buttholes have to be removed from all of the cats because these weird accidental buttholes have been placed upon them as well. Yeah, it's a saga for the ages. It had to be the film to end the book. I'm kind of glad I wrote it when I did, because if I'd written it a year or two later, I'd have probably had to stick on like Joker Folie à Deux, perhaps, or Megalopolis, one of those two, as the finale. But no, Cats for me was the most satisfying way to end.
Those last two that we've experienced in recent months, I think I might be in the minority of actually really liking Joker, the second Joker. I think I think it will be. People just seem to not like Todd Phillips, and he's not necessarily particularly. He comes out with some silliness, but I just don't think it's that bad a film.
I didn't hate it, I must say. I found it very perverse in a way. It's like you could compare it to Babe Pig in the City in a sense, in terms of its kind of like repudiation of everything that the first film seemed to be. The appeal that the first film seemed to have to people. It seems to be attacking that in a weird way. But eventually I just got bored of it, honestly. Eventually I just didn't know what it was kind of adding to replace that. So I was surprised that it did quite as badly as it did, I'm going to say.
And Megalopolis, I mean, has that finished its run now? Because it's a strange sort of rollout strategy on the part of Francis Ford Coppola as well.
Yeah, I don't think anyone, even he, expected that film to turn much of a profit, which is why I would differentiate it from, Intolerance all of those years back, 108 years before, another film which the director bankrolled by himself. But in Coppola's case, it's like the end of his life. He's been trying to get this thing made for so long. He's like, this is his last chance to do it. So if you've got vineyards to sell and you want to make this film, I don't really see why you wouldn't just do it. Perhaps it's made him happy, But I think everyone knew that it was not going to be a commercial proposition, that money was essentially going down in flames. And it has made something like $5 million, right, worldwide on a budget of 120, something like that. But it can't be chalked up as, this as a kind of great epochal failure that's going to bring a studio down, because it's Francis Ford Coppola's money. He's sort of paid for his own mausoleum there in a way.
Do you think there's any chance that film will get a sort of reevaluation years down the line, or is it? I mean, it feels like it when it came out, it was very wrapped up with the story of production and the various sort of back and forth that was going on there.
Everyone was reviewing the budget, reviewing the production, which is kind of a common theme with a lot of the flops in my book as well. That starts to happen from like the 60s, 70s onwards, when people get wind of like a runaway production. You start to read feature after feature, just sort of talking about all the expense. And I think that everyone was very focused on that. And people haven't particularly engaged with, the ideas in Megalopolis, but they are so kind of far-flung and so highfalutin in many ways that I feel as though they need translating. I feel like people just, because the film isn't well constructed enough to kind of rhetorically deliver those ideas in a coherent way, people have just dodged the challenge of engaging with it at all, except for a few, hardcore fans who have kind of gone in on it deep. But I just can't see that reevaluation happening, honestly, with that one. I think it's happened much more with Sorcerer, because Sorcerer was very difficult to see for about 20 years after it came out. It just was, it was deleted, essentially. It was one of those films that just kind of vanished. I don't ever remember seeing it on VHS. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it did exist in some form. But only now that it's been restored and there's this new Blu-ray and stuff and it's starting to get screened more, are people finally watching it and kind of going, oh, wow, this is actually one of Friedkin's great achievements, if not his greatest, which is what he thought it was. He said it was the one film he'd ever made where he wouldn't touch a frame, despite all of the agony of making it and the many kind of difficult parts of the shoot they had to do over and over and over again. He was supremely happy with the film when it came out, which is why it was such a shock to him when he opened the LA Times on the morning of its release to read his favorite critic, basically, Charles Champlin, saying, what went wrong? He was astonished. And I feel like only now do we disagree, or the disagreement with that verdict have real power. People now think, yeah, it's one of his great films.
I don't know. I think with my Emersonian mind, I will lay it open to Megalopolis at some point being being re-evaluated, but I don't know. I don't know. So, a final question, Tim. I want to ask if you have a film book recommendation for our listeners, something that you would like to recommend that maybe no pressure.
Other than your own book, John, about Terrence Malick that is coming out very soon. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's clearly going to be a big deal next year. John's full-length study of the life and work of Terrence Malick, The Magic Hours, which I have read and which is excellent. There's one other book that springs to mind, though, which is the reason that I didn't include a chapter on The Bonfire of the Vanities, Brian De Palma's adaptation of the Tom Wolfe novel. And that's because there's an amazing book about that production going awry, which is called The Devil's Candy, written by Julie Salomon. She was a Washington Post journalist who was invited on set throughout that shoot to oversee everything going from the casting through to the shooting of the film, when everyone thought this was going to be a big awards movie and sort of like perhaps the film of the year. She was sort of embedded on set, and then everything started going wrong from casting on down. And she was fully aware of it. She had kind of like ringside seats for all of it. And to his great credit, Brian De Palma just said, just write what you see. Just write it how it plays out. Just tell the truth, essentially. So she wrote one of the great accounts of a flop, The Devil's Candy. I couldn't have done a chapter on the film, honestly, because it would have just been a précis of her book. But yeah, I would thoroughly recommend people seek that out.
Was that a book sort of almost an inspiration for your own? Was that something that
For
you
sure,
saw?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are a few other examples of this. There's that book, Studio. Have you read that book before?
Oh, John Griffin Dunn.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. And also there's Final Cut, which is the account of the Heaven's Gate fiasco by one of the producers involved, Stephen Bark. It's a very good book indeed. And what's the other one about the Red Badge of Courage?
Oh, that is Studio, I think.
Well, there's also Mark Harris's Scenes from a Revolution about the 1967 Oscar race. Is an excellent book which deals with the flop of Dr. Dolittle.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Tim, I've really enjoyed talking to you once more about this book, and I absolutely this is a perfect Christmas present for any film lover because it's just because it's such an entertaining read, and it will have you laughing, but it will also educate you about the sort of the real chancy nature of the film industry.
Thank you. It's been a real joy once again. Thank you very much.